Well, it's great to, it is great to be here. I actually meant to come last Saturday too. You had your, what I consider one of the great high holy days in Shakespeare, the Field Day Parade. You know, in 1993, my first, I think, official job as minister here in Shakespeare was to be the judge, be one of the judges at the Field Day Parade, and that year I judged the large float category. The way it worked, you remember that you judge and then they put you in the back of a pickup truck and drive you around town. I don't know what the pickup truck has got to do with anything, but that's what happened. And I remember that year because there were only 3 floats in the category that I was judging. So you think it would be easy, but I think there were 2 bell floats and 1 Traxel float, or 2 Traxel floats and 1 bell float, something like that. I don't remember what it was. So I had to judge, you know, within 24 hours of being here, I had to judge people who were in my congregation. I thought, this is going to be a short little tenure here in Shakespeare. I better not put the paintings on the wall, the manse. But I remember that they paid you with tickets to the bar. 2 tickets. They said, you can take your wife. I didn't take my wife. I took both tickets and used them that year. The last time I came to Field Day, maybe this is why I haven't been to Field Day in a long time, I think it was a year or 2 after I left here, and I came back with my son Benjamin, and we went to the fish fry. And after the fish fry, there was this great game. It involved pigs and spelling. Do you remember that? They had these little pigs, and they put little muscle shirts on them with what was it called? Does anyone remember? Pig spelling bee or something? So Ben and I sat in the ballpark and we watched these poor jerks out in the field trying to gather up 2 pigs and make words. And I thought, these poor jerks. And then next thing you know, I was one of those poor jerks out in the field trying to gather up 2 pigs. And I discovered that I'm not a very good speller and I'm not a very good pig wrangler either. And I was kind of surprised at how competitive people were just making these 4-letter words out there. And I was out there asking these other guys for help, and they were using 4-letter words to tell me, no, I'm not helping you. Forget it. Every man and pig for himself. But I do remember coming up the field, and my son Benjamin was probably 10 or 12 at the time, and he was laughing hysterically, and I think I have framed a vocation trying to make my children laugh. So it's good to be back here. When I was the minister, the associate minister at St. Andrews in Hespeler, they operated a small food bank, or kind of like a food pantry, out of the basement of that church in downtown Hespeler. And there were always their shelves stocked with non-perishable items like soup and peanut butter and that sort of thing. And people from the community could come in and access that food anytime that the church was open. But then twice a month, I think it was a Thursday afternoon, we provided kind of a location for a broader selection of food items. And the way it worked, as I remember it, was that a couple of cube vans from the Cambridge Food Bank Network arrived in the morning, on Thursday morning, full of fruits and vegetables and frozen meat and bread, and all kinds of perishable items that a lot of people in Cambridge couldn't afford. I mean, I discovered that Cambridge was a good place for people to make money, and people were making a lot of money. But as with many urban places, there were people who were falling through the cracks and people having a hard time putting food on the table. So the trucks would arrive on a Thursday morning, we would unload the trucks and set up the tables in the hall. And the people would would come down the two lines where volunteers would stand behind tables and hand out things like tomatoes and squash and onions, that sort of thing. And then after the vegetables and that sort of thing, there was bread. And then finally, at the end of the line, there were desserts. And I usually work the bread table because, as I probably indicated to you already this morning, even if I'm not eating bread, I like to be around bread. I think I must have been a baker in a former life or something like that. And typically they would have all sorts of bread, rye bread and pumpkin seed bread and cheese bread and dinner rolls, all kinds of other fancy breads. And next to the bread station, as I said, was the dessert table. And one of the things that strikes me about doing anything like this is that regardless of income or color or creed, the vast majority of people are kind and gracious and grateful and friendly. And it was really, I think for the most part, a positive experience for me and the other volunteers. There was always a kind of, as I remember, a kind of friendly banter with the people who came. Folks talking about what they're going to do with the onions and swapping soup recipes. Everyone is friendly and gracious. But then as soon as people started getting closer to the desserts, it can go from really friendly and relaxed to a kind of Lord of the Flies situation in a flash. Every man for themselves, survival of the fittest. It is, I think, remarkable what the prospect of sugar will do to those of us who are addicted to it. You see, there was always a surplus of vegetables and lots of bread, but there was a scarcity of chocolate cake. Not enough cakes for everyone to have one. These are, for the most part, cakes from the grocery store that didn't get picked up. There would be one that said, "Happy Birthday, Doreen," and for some reason, Doreen didn't get her cake that year, decided not to celebrate, so they would send that cake to the food bank. And people really wanted those cakes. And I remember on my first day volunteering at the Thursday Food Bank, someone asked me if they could have a cake, and I said, "Sure." And I just grabbed the cake and handed it over. And then I was taken aside by the volunteer coordinator and chastised. Amy said, "You just can't give out cake like that, Rob. You're going to start a riot in this place." So after that, when someone asked me for cake, I would say, "I'm sorry, I'm only licensed to dispense bread today. You'll have to talk to someone." But I think it is true that regardless of income, education, race, and circumstances, when there's the possibility of chocolate cake and there's not enough for everyone, things can go from really jovial to really serious very quickly. But as I said, it was a very positive experience to do that sort of thing. And thinking back, I guess what I really like about it is that as a minister, I make my living using words. I do a lot of talking. I do a lot of talking about God, talking about loving people and caring for one another. And some days I feel like I do not enough doing it, practicing it. And so it gave me an opportunity to do something tangible, not just talk. Eventually, I think for all of us, we have to move from the thinking, the talking, to the doing. Some of you know that my daughter Abigail is using a new computer, eye gaze technology, to speak. Eye gaze technology. Some of you may have seen there was a piece on the Kitchener News that was actually picked up by the national news with Lisa LaFlamme. Is that how it was on TV, and some of you remember that when Abby was 2, she had a vocabulary of about 150 words. That's what we figured. We have videotape that I can hardly watch of her speaking, saying "daddy" and "puppy" and these sort of words that 2-year-olds will speak. And then, of course, with the onset of Rett syndrome, it seemed like overnight she lost that ability to speak. we were here for that nightmare. But now, and happily, with the help of this new computer technology, and after 14 years of not speaking, it turns out that Abigail has a lot to say. And we've experienced what has really been a fuller expression of her personality through this computer. She is funny, she is sometimes wickedly funny, and sometimes profound, and sometimes she can be pretty demanding with this computer. In fact, sometimes at school at Northwestern, Abby's teacher's aide will come and find Karen and say, I don't know what we're going to do. Abby's run out of food. She's been asking for food on her computer all morning, and we have been feeding her, or asking for food that they don't have, and so they've been running around, buying her food in the cafeteria, and so forth. And so there's been a learning curve, and Karen's told them, she says, Abby may just want to talk about food, not likely, but she might just want to talk about food, and you don't have to fill her every request. I mean, think about it. If they put a menu in front of me, I would be ordering off it all day, whether I was hungry or not. Karen, of course, is probably right. She's usually right. But I said, from the teacher's aide point of view, I get it. I get where they're coming from. They wonder if this child is hungry, which she seems to be almost all of the time. And of course, if you are hungry, it's not enough simply to talk about food. You have to find something to eat. You have to make a snack. At some point, you have to finally do something. At some point, the theoretical must become tangible. The abstract must become concrete. The Word must become flesh. The theologian Helmut Taylor told a story about a man who was walking down the street, and he saw a storefront window that had a big sign on it that said, "Fresh bread for sale." And so the man went inside and he said, "I'd like to get some of that fresh bread you have here." And the store owner said, we don't make bread." And the man said, "Well, sure you do. The sign says fresh bread." And the store owner said, "Oh, we don't make bread. We make signs." The story that I read to you a moment ago of the feeding of the 5,000 is one of the few stories that is told in all four of the Gospels. And in every version, the disciples are hung up by this seemingly insurmountable logistical problem. Where to get bread? There are 5,000 people here, Jesus. It's lunchtime. And they're all hungry. Providing for the crowd seems impossible. So the disciples suggest that they fend for themselves. They say to Jesus, I really think it's time to send them away. Maybe they could find a Tim Hortons somewhere. Rosemary's is a nice lunch, I hear. Send them there, Jesus. We can't possibly feed them. And to almost emphasize that the cupboards are empty, the disciples bring to Jesus a small child with his meager lunch in a basket, 2 fish, 5 barley bugs. And it's no surprise, I think, that the one who offers such a pathetic, measly meal of fish and bread to feed the crowd is a child. Those of us older than 7 would be too embarrassed. We'd be too self-conscious, maybe thinking that people are watching us, and what would they say? Well, some of us are holding on too tightly to what we have. We can't bear to give anything away. Save it for a rainy day. Oh, we don't like to admit it, but sometimes I think we're a little too selfish. Didn't we, in fact, earn what we've got, and we got it the hard way, we like to tell our children, by the sweat of our brow? God helps those who help themselves. Did you know that I heard that saying so many times growing up that I began to think that it was in the Bible? God helps those who help themselves. It's not. Benjamin Franklin said that. And it's been kind of adopted by Protestants, I think, over the years. God helps those who help themselves sometimes. And maybe here in this story, and more often, the Bible seems to say, God helps those who can't help themselves. God helps those who won't help themselves. And this, of course, is the nature and the scandal of Christ. But this little kid, this little child, in that wonderful way that children have of not knowing the impossible from the possible, offers what he says. He seems to say, I don't know how you're going to do it. I don't know how this all adds up. But whatever I have, it's yours. Jesus takes this small lunch. He blesses it. The disciples act as kind of waiters or busboys, and when it's time to clean up, there are 12 large baskets of bread left over. And you can imagine those disciples, dazed and confused, staring cross-eyed at those stockpiles of bread, maybe saying to one another, I have got to cut back on the tequila shots before noontime. But here Jesus offers us the new manna. 2 fish plus 5 loaves equals abundance. Bread that cannot possibly be consumed. Now, you've heard this story many times before. As I say, it's in all 4 of the Gospels. You can't really get around it. And I know that some have preached this and studied this, and they have said that really there is a perfectly rational explanation for what happened here. That this child, this boy, inspired the generosity in the crowd. That's what's really going on here. And then they, in turn, share the lunches that they were hiding or hoarding. There's nothing really supernatural. And I think that's a good interpretation. If that's what you think, then I think that's fine. I think that's a good interpretation, fine interpretation of the text. Then others, of course, insist on the miracle. And if you want to insist on the miracle, then that also is fine with me. I'm cool with that. But what I can't get over when I read this story is Jesus' words to the disciples near the beginning of this story. It almost sounds to me like some kind of commission of some sort. The people are hungry, Jesus. We have nothing for them. You need to send them away. And Jesus says, no. That's not how it works here. You feed them. You go on and see what you can put together for dinner. You feed them. It's your job. Stop looking behind you for someone who has more to lose. You feed them. Who knows? Maybe that is what God is saying to the church today. In my generation, we have done a great job of describing the decline of the modern and the mainline church. I have a number of books at home dedicated to what is wrong with the church. You're welcome to borrow them and keep them, actually. I've read them. I've read the books I have read the studies. I have seen the graphs. I have listened to the experts talk about the church that is clearly in demise. And you know, I get it. I get it. It's not 1955. Christendom is dead. But what I also think, and what I also know, is that if you listen too closely to the experts, and if you listen too long to them, you might get the impression that the cupboards are empty. Or maybe that all we have left in the church today is a couple of fish and a few loaves of bread. But you know, don't you, that it's not true. You, of all people, should know that you have much to share. I think I speak with some authority. I know this because I have sat at your table and you have shared your bread with me. And sometimes you shared your wine too. Some pretty good wine, I must say. I like to tell my children that when I came here in 1993, I was this pale-faced, anemic, skinny Toronto kid. And they say, well, what happened to you? Where is that skinny, anemic kid? I said, well, they started feeding me Shakespeare. I've been expanding ever since. Eventually, for all of us, we have to move beyond the thinking and the talking to the doing. Give them something to eat. I owe a tremendous debt to those people over 20 years ago who listened to my first sermons, and, to my home congregation in Toronto, to my wife Karen, who somehow over the years has somehow resisted the urge to run screaming out of the building when I open my mouth to preach on a Sunday morning. I think back about those first sermons. I don't know what I was thinking. Those logical, I use that word loosely, by the way, those logical three-point propositional sermons, I kind of cringe with embarrassment. Some people say you should recycle them, you should use them. Oh, I would never recycle those sermons. Gradually, I began to see the power of narrative in preaching. People like Terry Hastings and my father got me thinking about using stories and the power of narrative. And so I would beg and borrow and steal stories, as I still do today, everywhere I went, that I could use to feed my preaching. I guess you could say that at some point that I discovered that if you can tell a good story on a Sunday morning, sometimes people will think that they heard a good sermon. So I've been practicing this kind of deception for the last 21 years. So I want to end with one of my favorite stories. At the beginning of the 16th century, the Jewish people were expelled from Spain. Many went to France and Germany and Greece, and some went to the Holy Land, to Palestine. And among them was Jacobi, who was a shoemaker by trade. Jacobi was a kind man, but most of all, Jacobi was a devout man. Jacobi went to the synagogue every Sabbath and listened to what the rabbi was saying, even though Jacobi spoke Spanish and the rabbi spoke Hebrew. And one Sabbath, the rabbi mentioned in his sermon how at one time 12 loaves of bread were offered to God, and Jacobi heard and understood the words bread and God, and he got excited. Jacobi ran home and he said to his wife, Esperanza, Esperanza, he said, guess what? God eats bread. And you are the best baker in the whole country this week. Esperanza, you must make your best bread, and I will bring it to God. And so that week, Esperanza kneaded in the best ingredients and braided the dough with such love. And Jacoby later took 12 loaves of bread to the synagogue. Jacoby approached the ark. Señor Dios, Jacoby said to God, I've got your bread, and you will love it. My wife Esperanza, she is a wonderful baker. You will eat every crumb. And then Jacoby took the bread and put it in the holy ark. And no sooner did Jacoby leave than in came the shamus. The shamus is the man who is the caretaker, who cleans up at the synagogue. Shamus approached the ark and said, Lord, you know I want to be here in this holy place. That's all I want. But for 7 weeks now I haven't been paid. Lord, I need for you to make it a miracle. In fact, I believe that you're going to. Maybe you've already done it. Maybe I'll open the holy ark and there will be my miracle. And he walked to the ark and opened it, and there was his miracle. 12 loaves of freshly baked bread, enough for the whole year. The next day, Jacoby and Esperanza opened the ark and saw that their bread was gone. And a look of joy passed between them. The next week it was the same, and the week after, and this went on for months. The shamus learned to have faith in God, but if he hung around the synagogue or came too early, then there was no miracle. And so 30 years went by, and now an old man, Jacoby, came to the synagogue one day with his loaves of bread. Señor Dios, he prayed, I know your bread's been kind of lumpy lately. Esperanza's arthritis, maybe you could do something about that, God. You'd eat better bread. He put the bread in the ark and started to leave. When suddenly the rabbi grabbed him. What are you doing? The rabbi demanded. I'm bringing God his bread, Jacoby replied. God doesn't eat bread, the rabbi said. Jacoby said, he's been eating Esperanza's bread for the last 30 years. Then the man heard a voice and they hid. And no sooner did they hide than in came the shamus. I hate to bring it up, Lord, the shamus said, but you know your bread's been kind of lumpy lately. Maybe you could talk to an angel about that. When the shamus reached the ark for the bread, the rabbi jumped out and grabbed him. The rabbi sat the two men down and started to lecture them angrily, telling them that what they were doing was sinful. And Jacoby and the shamus began to cry. Jacoby cried because he only wanted to do good. And the shamus cried because he realized that there would be no more bread. Suddenly, they heard laughter from the corner. And they turned and they saw the great mystic, Rabbi Isaac, shaking his head and laughing. Rabbi Isaac said, No, Rabbi, you are wrong about these men. These men are not sinful. These men are devout. In fact, God has never had more pleasure than watching what goes on in your synagogue week after week. On the Sabbath, he sits with his angels and they laugh, watching this man bring the bread and the other man take the bread. All the while, God gets the credit. Then Rabbi Isaac looked at Jacoby and said, Now, Jacoby, you must do something even more difficult. You must bring your bread directly to the shamus. And when you do, you must believe with perfect faith that it is the same as giving it to God. You must bring your bread directly to the shamus. When you do, you must believe with perfect faith that it is the same as giving it to God. Thanks be to God.